Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wolf Pit. Today, we're going to be smoking mouth-watering, fall-off-the-bone tender and delicious St. Louis cut pork spare ribs and pork baby back ribs on our Memphis Pro wood-fired grill. These are super easy to make right in your backyard. Once you make these, you'll never want to go back to your local barbecue restaurant. So let's get started. For today's cook, I'm going to be using these 2 racks of Nature's Promise pork ribs. I've passed by this brand time and time before, but I've never tried them before. I think these are a healthier alternative to pork ribs. They're all natural, with no hormones, no antibiotics, and no animal byproducts in their food. And one thing if you notice, both racks weigh about the same size, which is unusual. Pork spare ribs are usually bigger than pork loin back ribs, also known as baby back ribs. But the rack of St. Louis cut spare ribs weighs just over 3 pounds, and the rack of baby back ribs weighs just over 2.5 pounds. And if you're wondering why I'm cooking 2 different racks of pork ribs, I gotta confess, I picked up the baby back ribs by accident. I usually favor the spare ribs over the baby back ribs because they have more fat, more meat, and more flavor. But when I got home, I thought it would be a good experience to share with you, the people, about cooking different types of ribs. So let's get the ribs out of the cryovac wrapping and see what they look like. Once we got the ribs unwrapped and out of the cryovac, both racks were very lean. Neither rack had a whole lot of fat, which to some people who don't like a lot of fat might be great. But me personally, I like a little bit of fat. Not necessarily an excess amount of fat, but a nice layer of fat. But other than the lack of fat, the ribs don't look that bad. Now I'm going to do something I normally do not do. And I've had a lot of you, the people, ask me to do it. I'm going to remove the membrane of both racks of ribs. And it's as easy as putting a butter knife between the membrane and the bone to loosen a little piece up. And then grab it with a paper towel so you can get a good grip, and then you pull the membrane right off. Normally I like to leave it on for 2 reasons. 1, I think it holds moisture into the ribs and makes for a better rib. And 2, once the ribs are done, the membrane gets a little bit crunchy and a little bit chewy, which I happen to enjoy. Some people do, some people don't. So if you like to leave the membrane on, leave it on. If you don't like to leave it on, take it off. Once we pulled off all the membrane, we seasoned with salt, pepper, and garlic. And you could actually stop right there and make the salt, pepper, and garlic your only seasoning, which is actually very good on its own. But I wanted to add some more flavor to these, so I added a little bit of barbecue rub. And you can use any kind of barbecue rub you like, your homemade barbecue rub or your store-bought barbecue rub. And then once you have as much seasoning on the bottom side, flip them over and repeat the same process. Season with salt, pepper, and garlic. And then a nice layer of barbecue rub. While we finish up seasoning the ribs, head on over and follow me on Instagram if you want to see foods I cook and eat and other random things I do that I don't record, and you might even get a sneak peek at an upcoming video. Once the ribs are seasoned to your liking, they can go right on the grill or into the refrigerator for a couple hours or even up to overnight. These ribs are going to go into the refrigerator for a little bit while we get our Memphis Pro wood-fired grill heated up. If you can operate and cook on your oven inside your house, then you'll have no issue operating and cooking on the Memphis Pro. It's basically the same thing with the benefit of the wood-fired flavor. All you gotta do is turn it on, and like I mentioned in a previous video, as soon as you turn it on, the grill automatically starts. It's not necessary to push a start or an ignite button. You can immediately hear the pellets dropping. Then using the up and down buttons, set your desired temperature. And today we're going to be cooking these ribs at 235 degrees. And I almost forgot to mention that we have our Memphis Pro 430 set up for indirect cooking with the heat deflector in. Speaking of indirect cooking, the Memphis Pro is the most uniform cooking grill I've ever cooked on, thanks to its not one, but two convection fans, which help circulate a higher volume of smoke and heat evenly throughout the grill. I haven't noticed any hot spots or cool spots. I'll do a future video cooking biscuits around the entire grill to show you exactly what I'm talking about. I know that sounds weird cooking biscuits on a grill, but you'll understand what I'm talking about when I do the video. Now while the grill's preheating, let's get our Genie tool out and clean our grates off. And as you can tell, the Genie tool and the grill need a good cleaning. The Genie tool is made specifically for Memphis grills and fits perfectly in the grates. It makes a good grate cleaner, and it does a really good job of cleaning your grates without having to use a wire bristle grill brush, which could lead to a possibility of getting a wire bristle in your food. That wouldn't be a good thing. Once the grates are nice and clean, close the lid of the Memphis Pro and let it come up to temperature. And we have to put the Genie tool back in the side storage compartment, otherwise this little innocent looking rascal will steal it and bury it in the sandbox, and it'll never be seen again. After about 10 minutes, our Memphis Pro is up to 235 degrees, and we're ready to add our ribs. We put the spare ribs in the back for no apparent reason other than them being the first ribs going on. And the loin back ribs in the front, also known as baby back ribs. Now we're going to close the lid and let these smoke for 2 hours. Normally for the spare ribs, I'd cook them for about 3 hours. But with them being pretty lean and just about the same size as the baby back ribs, I'm going to see what they look like after 2 hours. Now here's what our spare ribs and our baby back ribs look like after 2 hours. They look gorgeous so far. They formed a nice bark and the color is perfect. But the spare ribs and the baby back ribs look to be cooking about the same. So I'm going to wrap both racks in aluminum foil. I wrap the ribs in aluminum foil dry, but you can certainly add some liquid to it if you like, or some people use margarine, brown sugar, and honey. Or you don't even have to foil the ribs at all. There's many different methods and secrets, etc. on cooking ribs, and there's no right or wrong way, as long as you like the finished product. Now close the lid and let the Memphis Pro 430 do its thing, and cook these ribs for another 2 hours at 235 degrees. After 2 hours, for a total cook time of 4 hours so far, our ribs are tender and it's time to get them out of the foil. You don't want to leave them in the foil too long because the meat will turn mushy and they'll simply fall apart. Unless of course that's what you want. If it is, leave them in the foil for another half an hour or so. But I like my ribs to still have a little bit of integrity and be able to hold together when you slice them, and then be able to take a nice, clean, tender bite off of them without them falling all apart. These baby back ribs were already super tender, and I didn't want to take a chance and try to pick them up and have them fall apart, so we simply just slid them off the foil. Then we slid the baby back ribs out of the way and did the same thing with the spare ribs. And you'll see what I'm talking about when I said the spare ribs and the baby back ribs were basically the same size, because they're both cooking identically, they're nice and tender, and they have the same amount of pullback. And you can see how tender the baby back ribs are when we're moving them around to where they just started to rip apart. So now we're going to sauce these ribs and let them firm up a little bit. And the sauce we're using is a very secret recipe and pretty involved to make. But if you have a pen and paper handy, I'll tell you how to make it real quick. But let's keep the secret concoction between us, the people. The base of our sauce is a barbecue sauce called Sweet Baby Ray's. I know most of you have probably never heard of it because it's very rare and hard to find in a grocery store. But if you're lucky enough to find a bottle, squirt some in a bowl and mix it with a little bit of honey and a little bit of brown sugar, and that's our top secret, very complicated barbecue glaze. Once you've basted the bottom side of the ribs, close the lid and let them smoke for another 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, it's time to flip the ribs over. And as you can tell, these ribs are very tender and just barely holding together. So with a little bit of gentle persuasion, we got them flipped over without making a mess. Now before we sauced them with our secret glaze, I gave them one more light coating of rub. And then brushed on a thin layer of the glaze. You can put as little or as much sauce as you want on the ribs. Or if you prefer dry rub ribs, just skip this step. So after we have a nice thin coat on the ribs, close the Memphis Pro and let them go for 15 more minutes. After cooking for a total of 4.5 hours, our St. Louis cut spare ribs and our baby back ribs are done. That's 2 hours in the smoke, 2 hours foiled, and then another half an hour unfoiled and sauced. But like I said, these were small racks of ribs, and that's actually a pretty quick cook for ribs, so your timing will vary on the size of your ribs. So let's get these cut up, give them a try, and see how they turned out. So here's our pork St. Louis cut spare ribs and our pork baby back ribs. And yes, they do look different than they did previously. That's because for me, it's a little bit easier to flip the ribs upside down and cut them, and that way you get a nice clean straight cut. But it wasn't really important how they looked. These are just simple basic backyard barbecue ribs. The important thing was how they tasted. So we grabbed the baby back rib first. And it certainly looked tender and had a decent smoke ring, but I would have liked to seen a little bit of fat on it. But other than that, it was a decent looking rib. Most people don't like fat the way I do, so the lack of fat is really no big deal. It was just my personal opinion. And honestly, these baby back ribs were very tender, almost too tender. 2 bites and you had a very clean bone. Next we tried a spare rib. And again, it looks extremely tender, it looks moist, definitely moister than the baby back ribs, but I still would have liked to seen some fat. And it definitely looks tender, has a decent smoke ring, and was begging me to take a bite, which I happily obliged to do. That's one of the clean baby back ribs. There were too many different hands digging into the ribs, so the timing of the video was a little bit off. The combination of the applewood and cherrywood pellets I used was the perfect combination for these ribs, adding a really nice sweet and mild smoke flavor. The rub added a nice spice, and our very secret barbecue sauce combination added the perfect amount of sweetness. Now like I mentioned throughout the video, I love fat, especially pork fat, and the Nature's Promise brand of ribs I used today were definitely too lean for me. Even though they turned out very good, they just could have been a lot better with some fat. Fat gives meat moisture and flavor, and it makes me happy. So personally, I'll pass on buying Nature's Promise ribs again. But I was obviously the unicorn out of the group, because everyone else loved the ribs and said I should have made more. But I really do need to give a lot of credit to the Memphis Wood Fire Grill Pro 430. Like I said in the beginning of the video, thanks to the dual convection fans, combined with the intelligent temperature control with Wi-Fi, which I'll be going over the Wi-Fi in a future video as well, the Pro 430 is the most uniform cooker I've ever cooked on. And I'm not just saying that because Memphis Wood Fire Grills is sponsoring this video, which I thank them very much for doing so. I'm just stating a fact about how well the Pro 430 cooks. And then you have temperature control with the ITC, the intelligent temperature control. When you set your desired temperature on this grill and it reaches your desired temperature, you almost think the grill is broken because that temperature does not fluctuate. You don't have to take my word for it. See if you can find a local dealer that's doing demonstrations and see for yourself. I'll have a link to a dealer locator in the description of this video. Thank you all very much for watching. Please don't forget to like this video, subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with your family and friends, and I'll see you soon.